The casket was closed by the time I stopped looking for my son's face in the crowd. I'd looked for him at the door. I'd looked for him when the pastor called the family forward. I'd looked for him when they lowered my husband's casket into that ground, and the dirt hit the wood like something final, like a door shutting on 38 years. Tobias wasn't anywhere. People noticed. I could feel it the way you feel a draft in a warm room. Miss Odetta, from the church board, leaning to whisper to her sister, a cousin's eyes sliding to the empty folding chair I'd saved next to me. Nobody said anything to my face. They didn't have to. I sat there in my black dress, spine straight, hands folded, and I let 300 people watch me pretend my son's absence didn't feel like a second funeral. My name is Thelma Wingate. I'd been married to Deacon Wingate since I was 23 years old, and that morning I buried him without our only son standing beside me. If you're watching this tonight, I want to know where you're joining me from. Drop it in the comments, because a story like this deserves to be shared with people who understand what it means to hold yourself together in front of a crowd. The phone buzzed in my clutch purse halfway through the repast, while I was still shaking hands and accepting casseroles I didn't ask for. I almost didn't check it. Something told me to. It was Dorothy's page, a photo, her and Tobias on white sand, drinks the color of sunsets sweating in their hands, that ocean behind them so blue it looked painted. The caption sat right under it, plain as day, like she'd typed it without a second thought. No time to bury the dead. We need to enjoy life while we can. I read it twice. I don't know why I thought reading it again would change what it said. 61 likes already. I scrolled without meaning to, my thumb moving on its own, and there it was, Tobias's name in that little heart-shaped notification. My son had liked it. Not commented, not defended, not even scrolled past it out of decency. Liked it. Approved it. Put his name right there next to hers like a signature on a receipt. My hand went cold around the phone. Around me, people were still talking, still eating, still saying, "He's in a better place now." Like it meant something. And I stood in the middle of my own husband's repast, feeling like the ground had opened up a second time that day. I didn't cry. I want you to understand that. I didn't cry because crying would have meant I was surprised and some small, ugly part of me wasn't. Tobias had been distant for months. Short phone calls, missed Sundays. I'd made excuses for him the way mothers do, the way I'd been making excuses since he married that girl. But this, an hour after we put his father in the ground, this wasn't distance. This was a decision. I slipped away from the church hall, out to the parking lot where the air was cooler and nobody could watch my face fall apart. I stood by my car with that phone still gripped in my hand, staring at a picture of my son smiling like there wasn't a hole in the earth with his father's name carved into the stone above it. That's when it rang. Not a text. Not Dorothy calling to explain herself, though God knows I was ready for that fight. A call, from a number I didn't recognize, and something about it made my stomach drop before I even answered. I pressed the phone to my ear. My voice came out smaller than I meant it to. "Hello?" And then I heard it. A voice I had buried 3 hours ago. "Honey, come home right now." I drove home from the church with my hands shaking on the wheel, that voice still ringing in my ears. "Come home right now." I hadn't answered him. I hadn't said a word. I'd just hung up and driven, because whatever was waiting for me at that house, I needed to see it with my own eyes before I let myself believe it. The porch light was on when I pulled into the driveway. I hadn't left it on that morning. I walked up those steps like my legs belonged to somebody else. My key was already in my hand, but I never got to use it. The door opened before I touched the lock, and there he was, Deacon. Standing in our hallway in a gray button-down I didn't recognize, looking at me the way a man looks at something he isn't sure is still his. I didn't scream. I didn't faint. I just stood there in the doorway of my own home, staring at a dead man, and felt something in my chest go from grief straight to rage, without stopping anywhere in between. "Where have you been?" My voice came out flat, not a question, more like an accusation I already knew the answer to. "The Magnolia Inn, off Route 9. He said it plain, like it was nothing. 15 minutes from here." How does a man stay 15 minutes away for weeks without anybody seeing him? Cleophas checked me in under a different name. Paid cash, no card, no trail. Nobody was looking that close to home. 15 minutes. The whole time I'd been picking out a closed casket, since there was nothing left of him the county could hand back to me, standing in a funeral home deciding what to bury when there was no body at all. He'd been 15 minutes away, close enough to smell the same rain I'd been walking through. Something about that distance did more damage than the lie itself. If he'd been across the country, I could have told myself it was necessary, that he'd needed to disappear completely. But 15 minutes meant he could have stopped this any moment he wanted. He chose not to. "You were watching," I said. Not a question. I already knew. I needed to see who'd come looking, Thelma, who'd actually grieve and who wouldn't. I stepped back before he could reach for me. His hand had come up out of habit, the way it always did, and I put mine flat against his chest to stop it before it landed. "Don't." He froze. I watched something flicker behind his eyes, surprise, maybe hurt, like he hadn't expected 38 years of marriage to mean I'd let him touch me the same day I buried him. "I'm not your wife tonight," I told him. "I'm just a woman who spent this morning grieving a man who was never gone." He tried to speak, some explanation forming in his throat, but I wasn't ready to hear it. Not standing in that hallway, still in my funeral dress, still smelling like the church flowers. "I need you gone," I said. "Not forever. Tonight. I can't be in this house with you until I call you first." I watched it land on him, the fact that I meant it. He nodded once, slow, and reached for his jacket off the hook like he'd already known this was coming, like some part of him had planned for this too. He didn't argue. That almost made it worse. The door had barely shut behind him when my phone rang again. Not his number this time. I saw the name and my stomach dropped for a different reason entirely. Marisol. I answered, and before I could even say hello, I heard her crying on the other end, her voice breaking apart mid-sentence. "Grandma, nobody let me come. Nobody told me the funeral even started until it was already over." I stayed on the phone with Marisol until her crying settled into hiccups, promising her it wasn't her fault, that grown folks had made a mess of things, and she'd done nothing wrong. I didn't tell her the rest. Not yet. A 12-year-old didn't need to carry what I was carrying that night. I'd barely set the phone down when headlights swept across the living room window. Deacon's car, back all ready, like he'd been sitting somewhere close, waiting for the right moment to try again. I opened the door before he could knock, arms crossed, blocking the frame with my body. "1 hour," he said. "That's all I'm asking. Then I'll go, and I won't come back until you call." I stepped aside, not because I'd forgiven anything, because some part of me needed to hear it more than I needed to punish him. He sat at the far end of the couch, hands folded between his knees, and started talking before I could change my mind. "You remember my father's funeral?" I did. 11 years back. A small church, a modest casket, and a room full of relatives who couldn't wait for the repast to end so they could start arguing over the house. "Before we even left the cemetery," Deacon said, "my cousins were already dividing up his tools. His truck. Nobody cried, Thelma. Nobody said one true thing about the man himself. It was like he'd turned into property the second his heart stopped. His voice cracked, and something softened in my chest, despite myself. I understood that wound. I'd watched him come home from that funeral quiet for weeks after. That's 11 years old, Deacon. Why now? Because 3 weeks ago, at Sunday dinner, Tobias asked when I planned to update the will. Whether Dorothy's name should go on the deed on Ashcroft, in case anything happened to me. He smiled when he said it. I couldn't shake it for days. So, you decided to fake your own death, I said, to see if your family would do the same thing to you. I needed to know, before it was too late to do anything about it. And me? The word came out sharper than I meant it to. Was I part of your little test, too? He didn't answer right away, and that silence told me everything before he opened his mouth. Yes, he finally said. I needed to know if grief would win, or if it would just be paperwork to you, too. Something in me went still and cold. Understanding his wound was one thing. Being used to measure it was another entirely. 38 years, Deacon, and you still needed proof. I'm sorry, I am, but I had to know. Who else knew? I asked, because a man doesn't disappear without help. He hesitated, then said it plain. Cleophas. He's the one who ran it, made sure the investigation closed clean, made sure nobody looked too hard. He's known since the beginning. Cleophas. A man who'd sat at our dinner table more Sundays than I could count, who'd held Tobias as a baby, had known exactly what I was walking through this morning and said nothing. I sat with that for a long moment, feeling the ground shift under a friendship I thought I understood. I'll hear you out, I finally said. That's all I'm offering tonight, not forgiveness, just hearing. He nodded, relief loosening his shoulders like he thought the worst had passed. I wasn't finished. And if I had failed too? I asked, flat, staring at him without blinking. If I'd been the one out there celebrating instead of grieving, what then? He opened his mouth. Nothing came out. He didn't have an answer. And the longer that silence stretched between us, the more I understood he'd never actually thought that far. He left that first night the way I told him to, and it was 3 days before I called him back. 3 days of sitting in my own house deciding what kind of woman I wanted to be on the other side of this. The kind who forgave quietly, or the kind who made sure nothing like this ever happened to her again. When he walked back through that door, I didn't let him sit down first. If we're doing this, I said, you'll hear my terms before you say one more word. He nodded, standing there in the middle of the living room like a man waiting for sentencing. I lead, not you. Whatever happens next, I decide the pace. I decide who knows. I decide when. I watched him take that in. You don't get to disappear and then walk back in expecting to run things too. Agreed, he said, quiet. And you tell me everything. No more pieces. No more finding things out after the fact. He was still nodding when my phone rang. Fredonia's name lit up the screen, and something about the hour, past 9, past when she ever called just to talk, made me answer instead of letting it go to voicemail. Thelma. Her voice had that careful edge she got at work when something wasn't sitting right. I need to ask you something, and I need you to tell me the truth. Did Deacon lease out the Ashcroft Street property before he passed? My stomach turned over. No. Why would he do that? Because there's a lease filed on it, recent, and the contact listed isn't Tobias. She paused, like she didn't want to say the next part. It's Dorothy. I went still. Completely still. The kind of stillness that comes right before something breaks. Deacon was already on his feet, reaching for his keys off the counter like he meant to drive straight over to Tobias's house that instant. "Deacon." My voice stopped him cold. "Sit down." "Thelma, if they're moving on my property while I'm supposedly 6 feet under, sit down." I said it slower the second time, and he did, jaw tight, hands flexing like he needed something to grab onto. I thanked Fredonia, told her I'd call back tomorrow, and set the phone down on the table between us like it was evidence in a case I hadn't opened yet, because that's what it was becoming. I'd walked into this thinking Tobias was the only one I needed to watch. A son who skipped his father's funeral for a beach and a cocktail. But Dorothy's name on that lease, not his. That meant she had her own hands in something, moving pieces her husband might not even know about. 2 of them. Maybe working together? Maybe not. I thought back to every phone call with Dorothy over the years, every holiday dinner where she'd complimented my cooking a little too much, asked a little too often about the house, the property, what Deacon planned to do with it all someday. I'd brushed it off as a daughter-in-law making conversation. Now, every one of those memories sat differently in my chest. "We move on this tonight," Deacon said, "before they do anything else." I looked at him. Really looked, the way I hadn't let myself since he'd walked back through that door. And understood something clear as glass. He wanted to charge in like a man protecting his name. I wasn't interested in protecting anybody's name tonight. I wanted the truth, all of it, before either of us moved a single piece on this board. "No," I said. "We're not doing anything until I know exactly what they've already done." I was at the county records office by 9 the next morning, before they'd even finished unlocking the doors. Fredonia met me at the counter, but this wasn't a friend doing me a favor anymore. This was business, and I wanted it done right, on paper, where nobody could argue with it later. "I need everything filed on the Ashcroft property," I told the clerk on duty, a young man named Perry with a lanyard full of badges. "I'm the surviving spouse. That gives me the right to request it." He didn't ask many questions. Grief has a way of moving people quickly through paperwork. Fredonia pulled the file herself and laid it flat on the counter between us. I scanned every page, my finger moving down each line until I found what I was looking for. Or rather, what wasn't there. No power of attorney. Nowhere in that folder was there a single document giving Tobias any legal standing to touch that property, lease it, sell it, or so much as mow the lawn on my husband's behalf. He hadn't just overstepped. He'd invented authority out of nothing. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't slam my hand on the counter the way some part of me wanted to. I just stood there, quiet, feeling something in my chest go cold and still. The kind of anger that doesn't need to announce itself to be real. "Ma'am?" Perry said it carefully, like he wasn't sure if it was his place. "I remember your son, actually. He called here a few weeks back." I looked up. "Weeks back?" "Before all this happened, with your husband. He was asking when everything would clear. The estate, I mean. Kept asking how long probate usually takes if there's no complications." The words landed somewhere deep, somewhere colder than the lease itself had reached. Weeks. Tobias had been calling this office, asking about timelines, asking how fast he could get his hands on something, before his father had even disappeared, before there was a funeral to skip, before there was a Hawaii trip to plan. He'd been counting days that hadn't started yet. That wasn't a son caught off guard by grief and greed in the same breath. That was a man already waiting. I thanked Perry and headed for the door, folder pressed against my chest like it might try to get away from me. Fredonia caught up to me in the parking lot, voice low, checking around us before she spoke. "Thelma, whatever this is turning into, be careful how you move. Once you start pulling threads like this, people notice. Tobias isn't slow. He'll feel it before you're ready for him to." She was right. and I knew it. But sitting quiet while my son built something on his father's grave wasn't in me anymore. Not after this. I got in my car and sat behind the wheel a long moment before I even turned the key, running the timeline over in my mind. Weeks before, not days. Not a panicked reaction to sudden loss. Something had made him start counting early. Either he was simply that kind of man, cold enough to plan ahead for his own father's death, or somebody had told him something, given him a reason to expect it. I thought of Dorothy again. Her name on that lease. Her hands moving somewhere I couldn't see yet. I didn't drive home. I drove straight to Roscoe's office instead, folder still pressed against me, already forming the next question before I'd even sat down across from his desk. "I need you to look deeper," I told him, sliding the folder across. "Not just the lease, everything, every account, every document, every place Tobias might have put his hands these past few months. I want to know exactly what my son has already touched." Roscoe called 2 days later, and I knew before I answered that whatever he'd found wasn't going to be small. He didn't call to chat. He called when there was something worth interrupting a person's evening for. I put him on speaker so Deacon could hear it too. Deacon had been staying close since I'd allowed him back in the house, careful, quiet, like a man walking through a room full of things that might still shatter. "I found the loan," Roscoe said. No greeting, straight to it. Personal loan, 5 figures, taken out against Tobias's expected share of the estate. Legitimate lenders require actual probate paperwork before they'll touch that kind of collateral. He didn't have that. What he had was a fabricated estate filing, same forged letterhead as the lease. Deacon's face changed before he even said a word. I watched 38 years of knowing that man's expressions tell me exactly how deep this had landed. "Alone," Deacon repeated, like saying it twice might make it less real. Against money that wasn't even his to claim yet. I didn't say anything. I wasn't surprised, not really. Not after the lease, not after Perry telling me my son had been asking about timelines weeks before there was even a funeral to plan. This was just the next piece of a pattern I'd already started to see clearly. "How fast can we lock the trust?" I asked Roscoe. "Before he finds another door to walk through." "Fast as you want to move. But Thelma, I need you to hear the rest first." Something in his tone made me go still. I'd known Roscoe long enough to recognize when he was choosing his words carefully, laying them down one at a time, the way a man does when he knows the next thing he says will change the room. I pulled the loan paperwork, the date on it. He paused, and I heard papers shuffling on his end, like he wanted to be sure before he said it out loud. It was taken out the same week Deacon disappeared. Not after the funeral, not after word got around. The same week. The room went quiet enough that I could hear the refrigerator humming in the kitchen. Deacon sat down slowly, like his legs had stopped trusting themselves. "That's not possible. Nobody knew anything that early. Cleophas and I were the only 2 people who—" He stopped himself mid-sentence, and I watched the realization cross his face at the same moment it crossed mine. "Nobody official filed anything that week," Roscoe said. "No death certificate, no funeral announcement, nothing public. For Tobias to walk into a lender's office with confidence that money was coming that fast, he'd have needed a reason to believe it. Not a hope, a reason." My mind moved through every version of how that could happen, and none were comfortable to sit with. A leak, a guess that landed right. Or something worse, someone close enough to know what Deacon had planned before it happened. I thought of everyone in and out of this house this past year. Every conversation I'd assumed was harmless, and felt the ground under this whole plan shift beneath me. Deacon was staring at the phone like it had betrayed him personally. Cleophas wouldn't have said anything. I trust him with my life. You trusted him with your death too, I said. Quiet, not cruel, just true. And somehow my son knew to start counting money before there was even a body to bury. He didn't have an answer for that. I watched him turn it over and over, searching for some explanation that didn't lead where the evidence was already pointing. I stood up, done sitting with the fear alone. Someone told him something, Deacon. My voice came out steadier than I felt. The timing isn't an accident. Roscoe's warning stayed with me for 2 days before Fredonia called again, this time with something smaller but sharper. Dorothy had been asking around about a man named Cornelius Wade, a local buyer known for moving properties quickly, quietly, without much paperwork trail. Nobody had connected him to Tobias's name, only hers. Fredonia had gotten the name from a friend at Wade's office, who mentioned a woman matching Dorothy's description had called twice that week asking to meet in person rather than over the phone. People who want a clean deal usually don't mind a paper trail. People hiding, one prefer a booth in the back of a diner. I didn't tell Deacon where I was going that afternoon. I told him I needed air. I found them at a diner off Charlotte Pike, the kind of place with booths deep enough to disappear into if you picked the right one. I sat 2 booths back, a menu raised just high enough to hide my face, and watched my daughter-in-law lean across the table toward a man I'd never laid eyes on. I need this. Handled quietly, Dorothy was saying, her voice pitched low, but not low enough for the corner I'd chosen. A finder's fee, off the books. Once the lease to purchase clears, you take your cut, I take mine. Some instinct made me slide my phone from my purse and press record. Whatever this was, I wasn't walking out with nothing but memory to prove it. Wade shifted in his seat, uneasy. This isn't exactly clean? What you're asking. It's clean enough. Dorothy's smile didn't waver. Tobias doesn't need to know the details. He just needs the money to show up when it's supposed to. The ease in her voice unsettled me more than the words themselves. There was no hesitation in her, no first-timer's nerves. She spoke like a woman who'd done this kind of quiet arrangement before, somewhere, with someone, and walked away, clean every time. I thought back over the years. Every time Dorothy had mentioned a side project, every unexplained new handbag, every vague answer about how she spent her days beyond the part-time work she claimed kept her busy. I'd let those questions go, the way you let go of things that aren't your business. Watching her now, I understood I'd been looking away from something for a long time. My phone buzzed against my leg. Marisol, texting to ask if I'd seen her mother. My stomach dropped. If that child walked in here looking for Dorothy, there'd be no explaining my presence in that booth. No easy lie that wouldn't unravel everything I was trying to hold together quietly. I typed back, fast. Haven't seen her, baby. Try calling again in a bit. It wasn't enough. Through the window, I saw a familiar shape crossing the parking lot. Marisol, backpack slung over one shoulder, walking straight toward the diner door like she had every right to be there. I froze, my whole body going rigid in that booth, praying she'd turn around, praying for anything to pull her attention elsewhere. A car horn sounded from across the lot. Someone she recognized, calling her name. She stopped, turned, and climbed into a neighbor's car instead, waving before she disappeared down the street. I let out a breath I didn't know I'd been holding. By the time I looked back toward their booth, Wade was sliding a folded paper across the table, and Dorothy was tucking it into her purse with the same practiced calm she'd worn through the entire conversation. Whatever nerves she might have carried into that meeting were long gone by the time she reached for that paper. She stood to leave, smoothing her blouse, already composed for whatever version of herself she'd wear back home. Before she walked away, she leaned down toward Wade one more time. Just make sure Tobias never sees the paperwork. I'd gone to Roscoe's office that morning to sign the first round of protective trust paperwork, tucked into a side room while his assistant finished printing copies. I heard the front door before I heard the voice, and the voice before I heard the words. Loud, impatient, already annoyed before anyone had said a thing back to him. Tobias. I went still, pressing myself closer to the wall. The door between us opened just enough to let sound through. It had been years since I'd heard that tone in my son's voice. The one he used as a teenager, when he believed the world owed him something, and was simply slow in delivering it. I'd hoped that voice had died out somewhere between then and now. Standing there, I understood it had just been waiting for the right amount of money to bring it back. I need to know when this clears, he was saying. No greeting, straight past the receptionist toward Roscoe's open office door. It's been weeks. My father's gone. There's no reason this should still be sitting in limbo. Probate takes the time it takes, Mr. Wingate. Roscoe's voice stayed even, unbothered. The same calm he used on me when he was choosing his words with care. Rushing it doesn't serve anyone, least of all you. It serves me plenty. I've got things moving that depend on this. There was a pause, and I could picture Roscoe's face without seeing it. That patient, unreadable look he wore when he was letting someone talk themselves further out onto a limb. Things moving, Roscoe repeated, flat. A business, commercial property, downtown. I've already talked to a broker. I just need the capital to close. Tobias said it like it should have impressed somebody. This isn't complicated. I need this to move faster than it's moving. I heard papers shuffle, a chair creak. Roscoe, unhurried. I'll note your concerns. That's all I can do today. That's not good enough. Tobias's voice sharpened, condescension bleeding into every word now. Maybe you don't understand how this works. I'm not some walk-in client you can stall. This is my inheritance. It's an estate still in administration, Roscoe said, which means it isn't anyone's inheritance yet, including yours. The silence that followed had weight to it. I heard Tobias exhale, sharp, frustrated, the sound of a man used to getting his way and unused to being told no by someone who wouldn't blink. I'll be back, he said, tighter now. And I expect a different answer. Footsteps, fast, uneven with irritation. And then the front door again, harder than it needed to be. I stayed pressed against that wall a full minute after the sound faded, my heart going harder than I wanted to admit. A business. Already talking to a broker. Already spending money in his mind that hadn't cleared, wasn't his, might never be his, if I had anything to do with it. I slipped out the side entrance before Roscoe's assistant could ask why I hadn't come out sooner. I wasn't ready to explain what I'd heard, not yet. Not until I understood all of it myself. That evening, my phone rang. Roscoe's name on the screen. I know you heard some of it, he said, no preamble. But there's a piece you didn't. I made some calls after he left. He paused, and my stomach tightened before he said the rest. Thelma, that broker, Tobias already put down earnest money. Days ago, before he ever walked into my office demanding I move faster. I sat with that, letting it settle where the loan and the lease already had. In that cold, still place, my anger had started living. Where did he get it? I finally asked, though I already suspected. Same lender as the personal loan, Roscoe said. He's been building this longer than any of us wanted to believe. Marisol showed up on my porch 2 days later without calling first, backpack still on, like she'd walked straight from school without stopping anywhere in between. I opened the door before she could knock a second time, and one look at her face told me this wasn't a casual visit. "Can I stay a while?" she asked. "I don't really want to go home yet." I pulled her inside without asking why. Some things a grandmother doesn't need explained. I made her tea she didn't really want, more for something to do with our hands than anything else, and we sat at the kitchen table in a quiet that stretched longer than usual. She turned her mug in slow circles, watching the steam instead of me. "Grandma, why does everybody act like Grandpa's death was just business?" She said it carefully, like she'd been turning the question over for days before finding the nerve to ask it out loud. "Nobody at home even talks about him anymore. It's like the funeral happened and then everybody just moved on to something else." I chose my words slowly, the way you do when a child asks a question too honest for the answer you're allowed to give. "Grief looks different on different people, baby. Some people get quiet. Some people get loud. Some people—" I stopped myself before I said too much. "Some people run from it however they know how." She nodded, though I could tell it didn't fully satisfy her. Children can feel when an answer is missing something, even if they can't name what. "I heard Mama on the phone the other night," she said, quieter now, eyes dropping to the table. "She didn't know I was still awake. She kept saying the money over and over, like it was the only thing that mattered. I don't know who she was talking to, but she sounded different. Not like Mama." My protective instinct rose up so fast, it nearly knocked the breath out of me. I kept my face still, kept my voice even as everything in me wanted to demand every detail. What time? What tone? What else she might have heard through that thin apartment wall. "Different how?" I asked, gentle, careful not to push too hard and scare the rest of the memory back into hiding. "Excited, almost. Happy, but not a good kind of happy." Marisol frowned, working to put words to something she didn't have the language for yet. Like she was talking about a present she already knew she was getting. I understood immediately what she couldn't yet. That Dorothy, careful enough to meet a stranger in a diner 2 towns over, careless enough to let her own daughter overhear that conversation from behind a bedroom door. People forget children are always listening, always absorbing more than the adults around them realize, filing it away even when they don't understand what they're holding on to. I reached across the table and took Marisol's hand, holding it the way I used to when she was small enough to fit in my lap during thunderstorms. Sitting there, watching her turn that mug in slow circles, I understood something had shifted in me since the funeral, the lease, the loan, the diner booth. This wasn't just about protecting an estate anymore, or proving a point to a son who'd forgotten his raising. This child had nothing to gain and everything to lose, and whatever came next, I wasn't going to let her be collateral in a war her parents had started. "Whatever's happening with the grown folks," I told her, "you are not going to carry it. That's my job, not yours. You hear me?" She nodded, but her eyes were still searching mine, looking for something I wasn't ready to hand her yet. "Grandma," she said, voice small, "is something wrong with Mama and Daddy?" I called Tobias myself, kept my voice light, told him it was time we started moving forward as a family. I asked him to come by Sunday, just the 2 of us. No Dorothy, no distractions. He said yes, faster than I expected. And that alone told me something about how badly he wanted whatever he thought this visit meant for him. He arrived with a bouquet of grocery store flowers and a hug that lasted a beat too long. The kind of hug performed for an audience even though we were alone in my own living room. "I've been meaning to come by," he said, settling onto the couch like he hadn't skipped his father's funeral 2 weeks earlier. "Things have just been so heavy since Dad passed. I didn't know how to face it." I poured tea I didn't want either of us to drink, using the ritual to buy myself a moment before I answered. Heavy enough to keep you in Hawaii? His face did something practiced then. A flicker of pain that arrived just a half-second too smoothly, like he'd rehearsed the exact shape his grief should take before he ever walked through my door. That trip was booked months in advance, he said. We tried to change the flights, Mama. There just wasn't time. I let that sit in the air between us, unchallenged, watching him relax slightly at my silence, mistaking it for acceptance. I heard something troubling, I said, keeping my tone conversational, curious rather than accusing. About a lease on the Ashcroft property. Something flickered behind his eyes, gone almost as fast as it appeared. I don't know anything about a lease, Mama. Why would I touch Dad's property without talking to you first? That's what I thought too, I said. Strange, then, that Dorothy's name is the one listed as the contact. Dorothy handles a lot of our paperwork. She probably just... He stopped himself, recalibrating mid-sentence, searching for a version of the story that would hold. I'll ask her about it. I'm sure it's nothing. I watched him find his footing again, smooth as ever, no stumble lasting longer than a breath. This wasn't a man caught off guard by an accusation. This was a man who'd built a wall of easy answers a long time ago, brick by brick. I thought back through small moments I'd waved away without a second look. A missing 20 from my purse. When he was 16, he swore he never touched. A story about a wrecked car that never quite added up. The easy way he always turned a question about himself into a question about someone else. I'd told myself that was just Tobias being Tobias. Watching him now, calm across my own coffee table, I understood I'd been giving him practice for this exact moment for years, without meaning to. And the loan, I said, still gentle, still just a mother asking questions. The one against the estate. What loan? His confusion looked almost real. Almost. I studied him across that coffee table, my own son, lying to my face with an ease I'd apparently been excusing my whole life without calling it what it was. This wasn't his first deception. It was simply the first one I'd finally learned to see clearly. He left an hour later with another too-long hug, promising to look into everything and get back to me soon. Already halfway to the door before the promise finished leaving his mouth. I stood in my living room long after his car pulled away. The flowers he'd brought sitting untouched on the counter, wilting a little more with every minute that passed. You should have just told me the truth, I said. To no one. To the empty room. To the version of my son I used to believe existed. Roscoe called Wade's title company 2 days before the scheduled closing, formal and precise, requesting they verify the attorney letterhead attached to the lease to purchase authority before any funds changed hands. It was a simple, quiet request. He didn't accuse anyone of anything. He just asked them to look closely. I hadn't slept well the night before, turning over what this moment might actually look like once it arrived. Part of me had braced for guilt, some maternal instinct rising up at the last second to shield my son from the consequences he'd built for himself. That instinct never came. What came instead was a strange, steady calm, the kind that settles over you once you've made peace with watching something necessary happen. I insisted on being there when they did. We sat in the title company's waiting room that morning, Roscoe beside me, both of us watching the closed door of the conference room where Tobias and Wade had already gone in. All smiles, ready to finalize what Tobias believed was already his. It didn't take long. The door opened faster than closings usually end, and Wade came out first, his face gone hard, a folder gripped tight enough in his hand that his knuckles had lost their color. Tobias trailed behind him, still talking, still trying to smooth something that had clearly already cracked wide open. This letterhead isn't real, Wade said, loud enough that the receptionist looked up from her desk. He wasn't speaking to me or Roscoe. He was speaking to Tobias, and he wasn't bothering to lower his voice anymore. I had my own attorney check it against the firm's actual records this morning. There's no attorney by that name at that address. Never has been. Normally, we just check the formatting and the notary seal. Nobody calls to confirm a firm exists unless somebody specifically asks us to look deeper. Your father's attorney asked. There has to be some mistake, Tobias said. And for the first time since this had all started, I heard something crack in his voice, something that wasn't performance. I got that from, I was told it was legitimate. Told by who? Wade demanded. Tobias didn't answer. His eyes moved around the room, landing briefly on me before sliding away just as fast, like he already understood exactly who'd made this moment happen and didn't have the nerve to say it out loud. Do you understand what you've done? Wade's voice had dropped, but the fury underneath it hadn't. I put earnest money into a deal built on a forged document. That's not a misunderstanding. That's fraud, and my name is attached to it now whether I like it or not. I'll fix it, Tobias said, already backing toward the door. The confidence I'd watched him wear like armor in my living room completely gone. Give me a few days, I'll straighten this whole thing out. There's nothing to straighten out. Wade's laugh had no humor in it at all. The deal's dead. I'm walking away, and I'm keeping every piece of paperwork you handed me because I have a feeling I'm going to need it. Tobias's composure had fully abandoned him now, sweat visible at his temples despite the office's air conditioning, his hands opening and closing like he was searching for something solid to hold on to and finding nothing. I watched my son standing in that lobby, exposed for the first time in his adult life with no smooth answer ready, no version of the story that would hold, and felt something in me that wasn't quite satisfaction and wasn't quite grief either. Just the cold certainty that this had needed to happen. Wade gathered his folder, turned toward the exit, and paused just long enough to look back at Tobias one final time. I'm not the one you should be worried about right now. Deacon called me that evening, his voice tight in a way I'd rarely heard in 38 years of marriage. Wade went to the police, Thelma. Filed a report. Forgery, fraud, the whole thing. Official now. I sat down slowly, the weight of it landing, even though I'd known this was where all of this had been heading. Knowing something is coming and feeling it arrive are two different kinds of heavy. There's more, he said. Cleophas called me an hour ago. Something in his tone told me before he said it. He's recusing himself. Says he can't touch this case, not with his history running the original investigation into my disappearance. Says it would compromise everything if anyone connected the two. Deacon's voice cracked slightly. He's handing it to a colleague with no ties to any of us. And what happens to you, Deacon, once his case is open? You filed a false disappearance. Somebody has to formally close that file. I know. I have to report back in myself. If anyone looks too closely at how clean that investigation was, it doesn't just cost me. It costs Cleophas his badge. I understood immediately what that meant, even before Deacon said the rest out loud. This wasn't a family matter anymore, something we could manage quietly between people who loved each other. This had become a case file, a number, something moving through a system that didn't care whose son was on the other end of it. Every step until now had felt like something I could still guide, still stop if the moment called for mercy instead of consequence. Wade walking into a police station changed that permanently. Whatever happened to Tobias next wouldn't be decided at my kitchen table. It would be decided by strangers who'd never met him, reading his name off a report. I need to check on Marisol, I told him, already reaching for my keys. She shouldn't be alone in that house tonight, whatever's coming. I drove to Tobias and Dorothy's place with my stomach in knots, unsure what I'd find. The porch light was on. Through the front window, I could see Marisol curled on the couch with a book, and beyond her, Tobias pacing the kitchen with his phone pressed to his ear. Dorothy nowhere in sight. Marisol let me in, relief flooding her face the second she saw me. I settled beside her on the couch, one hand resting on her back. My attention split between comforting her and watching Tobias through the kitchen doorway. His pacing had a jagged rhythm, quick steps, sudden stops, like a man whose body couldn't decide whether to run or stay still. He kept running his free hand through his hair, a habit I recognized from when he was small and frightened of thunderstorms. "I don't understand," I heard him say into the phone, voice pitched low but not low enough. "This is a misunderstanding. I can explain everything. I just need—" Whoever was on the other end wasn't interested in explanations. I watched his face lose whatever color it had left. Marisol tugged my sleeve, whispering, "Grandma, is Daddy okay?" "I don't know yet, baby," I said honestly, because there was no version of a comforting lie that would hold up against what I could see happening 10 feet away. Tobias ended the call and stood frozen in the kitchen, staring at nothing. Phone still gripped like it might ring again if he held on tight enough. Then it did ring. A different number, one he clearly didn't recognize, judging by how his whole body tensed before he answered. He picked it up, and I watched his face change one more time, the last of his composure finally giving way entirely. "This is Tobias Wingate," he said, voice barely holding steady. A pause, longer this time. "Yes, I understand. When would you like me to come in?" Detectives, wanting to speak with him directly. I called Tobias myself and told him we needed to discuss the estate, formally, at the house, just the two of us. I kept my voice measured, businesslike, giving him nothing to read into beyond what the words themselves said. He agreed to come Thursday evening, and I spent the 2 days before that making sure everything was exactly where I wanted it. Roscoe had given me copies of everything: the forged letterhead, the lease agreement, the loan documents, the earnest money receipt. I laid them across the dining room table in careful order, like evidence at a trial, because in every way that mattered, that's exactly what this was. Deacon waited in the back bedroom, door cracked just enough to hear, exactly as we'd planned. Tobias arrived on time, wearing the same careful concern he'd worn during his last visit, already rehearsing whatever version of himself he thought this conversation required. "Mama, I know things have been tense, but I promise, whatever you heard about the detectives, I can explain." "Sit down, Tobias." Something in my voice stopped him cold. He sat. I didn't waste time with softness. I turned the first document toward him. The forged letterhead, highlighted where the fake attorney's name sat in plain black ink. "This is a felony," I said. "You know that." His face drained of color. "Mama, I can explain the lease." I slid the second document beside it, the loan paperwork. "And this. I was going to pay it back the moment everything cleared, I swear." I placed the third document down without a word. The earnest money receipt, dated weeks before his father's disappearance, was ever made public. Tobias stared at that last one the longest, understanding dawning slow and terrible across his face. "How did you get all this?" "I built it," I said simply, "piece by piece, while you were busy spending money that was never yours." His composure cracked fully then, his hands trembling as he reached for the papers, like touching them might change what they said. "Mama, please. I don't know what came over me, You just decided your father's death was an opportunity," I said, flat, unflinching, "before there was even a funeral to plan." He opened his mouth, some fresh excuse forming, and I let the silence stretch a moment longer than I needed to, savoring it in a way I wasn't proud of, but didn't regret either. 38 years of marriage, 6 weeks of grief, that turned out to be a test. And it had come down to this table, these papers, this son finally out of easy answers. That's when the bedroom door swung open. Deacon stepped into the dining room. Tobias froze completely, every muscle in his body locking at once, his eyes wide and disbelieving, staring at a man he had buried weeks earlier, standing very much alive in our dining room doorway. "Dad?" The word came out broken, barely a whisper. "I'm alive, son," Deacon said quietly. "I've been alive this whole time." Tobias's gaze shot back and forth between his father and the documents spread across the table, between the impossible fact of Deacon standing there breathing and the undeniable proof of everything he'd done, believing that man was gone forever. I watched something collapse in my son's face. Not just fear now, but a dawning, sickening understanding of exactly how thoroughly he'd been caught, and by whom. For years, he'd underestimated me, treated my patience as softness, my quiet as permission. Watching that assumption die in front of me, right there at my own table, was its own kind of justice, separate from anything the law would eventually decide. His eyes finally landed on me, searching, desperate for some explanation that would make this make sense. "How long?" he asked, voice shaking, barely holding together. "How long have you both known?" Roscoe called 3 days after that dinner table confrontation, his voice carrying a different kind of weight than before. "Wade's attorney filed additional documentation in the fraud case," he said. During his statement, Wade named a second person involved in the property deal, Dorothy. I closed my eyes, not surprised exactly, but tired, in a way that went bone deep. The commission, he confirmed. "It's all on record now. Whatever she thought she'd kept separate from Tobias isn't separate anymore." I thought immediately of Marisol, alone in that house, with whatever was about to unfold between her parents. And I was in my car within minutes. I arrived to raised voices already spilling out through an open window, loud enough to hear from the driveway. I let myself in through the unlocked front door. Marisol nowhere in the living room, probably hiding in her room the way children do when the walls of a house start shaking. "You knew Wade this whole time?" Tobias's voice cracked through the kitchen, disbelief and fury tangled together. "You had your own deal with him, behind my back?" "I did what I had to do," Dorothy shot back, no apology in her voice at all. Somebody in this marriage needed to think ahead. Think ahead? You stole from me, from us. I didn't steal anything. I made sure we'd have something if your little scheme fell apart, which, look around, Tobias, it did. I stood frozen in the hallway, unseen, watching two people who'd built a life together tear it down brick by brick, each accusation landing harder than the last. "How long?" Tobias demanded, voice breaking. "How long have you been lying to me?" Dorothy's laugh had no warmth in it. "About the same amount of time you've been lying to your own mother about that lease. We're not so different, you and me. I just didn't get caught. First?" The silence that followed was worse than the shouting had been. I watched something die in my son's face, a final piece of trust he hadn't even realized he was still holding on to until this exact moment. "Get out," he said, quiet now, hollow. "Gladly." Dorothy was already moving past him toward their bedroom, pulling a suitcase down from the closet shelf with hands that didn't shake at all. None of the rattled fear I'd watched consume Tobias these past weeks. She threw clothes into the bag with quick, efficient movements, a woman who'd clearly rehearsed this exit in her mind long before tonight ever arrived. Tobias stood in the doorway, watching her pack, saying nothing now, whatever fight had been in him completely spent. "Dorothy!" His voice came out smaller than I'd ever heard it. "How could you—" She zipped the bag shut before he could finish the question and walked past him without a single glance back. A small sound came from down the hall. Marisol, standing in her doorway in socked feet, having clearly heard every word of it. I crossed the hall quickly and pulled her into me before she could take another step toward the noise, turning her face gently into my shoulder the way I had that very first night on the phone, weeks ago now, when none of this had a shape yet. "I don't want to live here if they're going to be like this," she whispered against me. "You don't have to figure any of that out tonight," I told her, smoothing her hair the way I used to when she was small. "Tonight, you're coming home with me." Behind us, I heard the front door open and close. Dorothy, gone, suitcase wheels clattering across the porch and down the steps into whatever life she'd already planned for herself long before any of this collapsed. Somewhere behind us, Tobias stood alone in the wreckage of a marriage built on lies neither of them had bothered to share with the other. Roscoe finalized the trust on a Tuesday morning, the kind of ordinary day that didn't feel like it deserved to carry something so heavy. Marisol's name sat at the center of it now, every provision written airtight, untouchable by either of her parents no matter what came next in their separate reckonings. "No one can touch this," Roscoe told us, sliding the final papers across his desk for signatures. Not Tobias, not Dorothy. Regardless of how either of their situations resolves, it's hers, fully protected until she's old enough to manage it herself, and structured so she'll have guidance even then. Marisol sat beside me while we signed, quiet, taking it in with the careful seriousness of a child who'd learned more about grown-up consequences these past weeks than any 12-year-old should have too. She didn't fully understand every clause. She understood enough that whatever happened to her parents now, she had something solid underneath her that nobody could take away. I felt something loosen in my chest, watching her exhale for what felt like the first time in weeks. Tobias's case was still moving through the courts, slow the way these things always are, his future sitting in the hands of people who owed him nothing. I hadn't decided yet what my relationship with him would look like on the other side of it, whether love and consequence could sit in the same room without one canceling out the other. That was a question for another season of my life, not this one. Tonight belonged to what we'd managed to protect, not what we'd lost. Deacon drove us home afterward, quiet himself, glancing at me every few minutes like he was still waiting for something, still unsure where he stood after everything that had unfolded since that phone call in the church parking lot. That evening, after Marisol had gone to bed in the guest room she'd claimed as hers these past weeks, Deacon found me on the back porch, standing where I always stood when I needed to think clearly. "I know I haven't earned anything," he said, careful, keeping his distance. "I'm not asking you to say it's all right. I just needed you to know I understand that." I turned to look at him properly, this man I'd buried and unburied and questioned every single day since, and felt something settle in me that had been unsettled since that first phone call. "I'm not forgiving you because enough time has passed," I told him. "And I'm not forgiving you because you're my husband, and that's what's expected of a woman like me. I'm forgiving you because I've decided to, on my terms, in my own time, and not one day before I was ready." He nodded, careful not to reach for me too fast, waiting. "That's different from what you did," I said. "You tested my love without asking. I'm choosing yours, with my eyes wide open. Those aren't the same thing, and I need you to understand that difference for the rest of our lives together." "I understand," he said, and for the first time since he'd walked back through that door, I believed him completely. I let him take my hand then, out on that porch, the night settling quiet around us, Marisol safe and sleeping, just inside. Tobias, somewhere across town facing whatever came next. Dorothy gone to build whatever life she'd already planned before any of us knew to stop her. Deacon went inside eventually, leaving me alone with the night a little longer, the way I liked it. I buried a man who wasn't dead, and I still found my way back to him. That's not weakness. That's a woman who knows exactly what she's worth.